The air tastes like iron, not metaphorically, literally. The dust kicked up by 25,000 men marching in the September heat of the Levant coast carries blood in it now. Arrow blood, horse blood, the blood of men who have been standing inside a storm of fletched shafts for hours and have not been allowed to fight back. It is September 7th, 1191, and somewhere on a strip of flat coastal earth between the Mediterranean Sea and an oak forest, a column of crusaders is being eaten alive. Not by swords, not yet, by arrows. Thousands of arrows fired from horseback by riders who circle and wheel and vanish into the dust before a single crossbow bolt can answer. The men at the back of the column have it worst. They are the Hospitallers, warrior monks whose entire order exists to heal the sick and protect the faithful. Right now, they are doing neither. Their shields bristle with shafts. Their horses scream and buckle under the impacts. Their wounded pile up at the edges of the formation like driftwood against a wall. And every time the Grand Master sends a rider forward to beg the king for permission to fight back, the answer comes back the same. Hold, not yet. The man giving that order is Richard the Lionheart. He is 33 years old, and he is watching his army bleed on purpose, because he knows something every one of those desperate Hospitallers does not. He knows what happened 4 years ago at a place called Hattin, when the last Crusader army broke formation, chased the enemy, and was annihilated almost to the last man. He will not let that happen again. Not today. Not if he can hold his nerve for just a few more minutes. What happens in those minutes will become one of the most devastating cavalry charges in medieval history. But here is the question that historians have argued about for over 800 years. Did Richard actually give the order to charge? Or did his own men disobey him, break ranks without permission, force his hand, and accidentally win one of the greatest battles of the Crusades? The answer depends on which chronicle you trust, and they do not agree. There is something else you need to understand before we get to the charge itself. That number, 17 minutes, the one in the title. It does not appear in any medieval source. No chronicler on either side timed the decisive phase with a clock. So what actually happened on that plain? How long did it really take for Richard's knights to shatter Saladin's army? And why does the answer to that question matter less than the question of what Richard did in the 2 weeks before anyone swung a sword? By the end of this video, you will know exactly what unfolded that day, minute by agonizing minute. You will understand why the restraint was the weapon. And you will understand something the legend of the Lionheart almost always leaves out. The charge lasted minutes. The restraint lasted weeks. And in the end, it was the restraint that made everything possible. But not everything, because this is also a story about a victory that changed almost nothing. And two men who gave everything they had to a war, neither one of them won. To understand what happened at Arsuf, you need to understand the two men riding toward each other across the dust of the Levant coast. And you need to forget everything the legends have done to both of them. Start with Richard, 33 years old, third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, raised not in London but in the sunlit courts of southern France. He wrote poetry, he composed songs, he spoke several languages. He spent so little time in England that he once reportedly joked he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He was more troubadour than bureaucrat, more Aquitanian than English. But by universal agreement of friends and enemies alike, he was one of the most dangerous battlefield commanders alive. He had been fighting since he was 16. He understood cavalry the way a musician understands an instrument. Not just the mechanics, but the timing, the feel, the exact moment when the thing is ready to be released. He was not a lion roaring into battle. He was a man with the nerve to wait. And waiting, as he would prove at Arsuf, was the most lethal weapon he possessed. Now meet the man waiting for him. Saladin was 53 years old, Kurdish by birth, Sultan by will. He had risen from a minor military household to command an empire stretching from Egypt to northern Iraq. In 1187, he had done what no Muslim commander had managed in nearly a century. He had retaken Jerusalem. He had stood on the walls of the holy city, wept openly, and called himself the instrument of God's will on earth. He had also, in victory, shown a restraint that shocked his enemies. He had not massacred the Christian population. He had allowed the poor to leave without ransom, and paid for many of them out of his own treasury. The man his enemies called a tyrant was in many ways more merciful than the men who opposed him. But understand something about Saladin. In the autumn of 1191, he was already running out of time, though he did not yet know it. He was 53 in an era when 53 was old. Years of continuous campaigning had worn his body down. His treasury, perpetually drained by war and by his own generosity, was stretched thin. His empire was held together by personal loyalty to him, and personal loyalty dies with the person it is owed to. When a fleet of English and French ships had delivered a new Crusader army to the Levantine coast, Saladin had taken it personally. A head of state does not lead an army across hundreds of miles of hostile ground in summer heat to execute a strategy. That is fury. That is a man who has built something and will not watch it be unmade. 4 years earlier at Hattin, Saladin had engineered the destruction of the Crusader army with a combination of tactical brilliance and patient waiting. He had provoked the Crusaders into breaking formation. He had cut them off from water. He had burned the hillside around them and destroyed nearly the entire fighting force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a single afternoon. The fall of Jerusalem followed within months. Richard knew all of this. Every knight in his column knew it. They were marching through the ghost of the army that had died before them, and the temptation to repeat that mistake grew stronger with every arrow that found its mark. On August 22nd, Richard broke camp at Acre and turned south. 25,000 men. The column stretched for miles along the coastal road. Knights, infantry, crossbowmen, baggage wagons, camp followers, and the wounded who could still walk. To their left, the Mediterranean. To their right, Saladin's entire army, shadowing them through the hills like a wolf trailing a herd. Richard organized the march with obsessive precision. The Templars under Grand Master Robert de Sablé led the vanguard. French contingents held the center. At the rear, bearing the most dangerous position in any marching column, rode the Hospitallers under Grand Master Garnier de Nablus. The key to the formation was this. Richard placed his cavalry, the knights, the armored fist of the army, in the center of the column, shielded on both sides by infantry. Crossbowmen rotated along the outer edge, firing and falling back to reload, behind shield-bearing foot soldiers. The fleet sailed alongside, carrying supplies. Nothing left to chance. The march covered roughly 45 miles. It took 2 weeks, 8 to 10 miles a day, every mile paid for in blood. Saladin's horse archers struck at the flanks, at the water points, at the stragglers. They fired from a distance, wheeled away before the crossbowmen could answer, and came again and again. Day after day, Richard's men marched with arrows jutting from their shields, their padded armor, sometimes their flesh. They did not break formation. They did not chase. Richard had given one order, and he repeated it like a prayer. Hold. And somewhere in that moving column, marching with arrows in their armor and fire in their chests, were men whose names no chronicle preserved. The crossbowmen from northern France, who rotated to the edge of the formation, fired, stepped back, reloaded, stepped forward, fired again. Not in glory, not in legend, in the grinding mechanical work of survival. Without those men, and thousands like them, there would have been no charge to launch. There would have been nothing left to launch. For 2 weeks, that was enough to hold the line. On the morning of September 7th, it would no longer be. On the morning of September 7th, the column reached the open plain north of Arsuf. The oak forest rose to the east. The sea glittered to the west, and Saladin committed everything he had, 35,000 men drawn from Egypt, Syria, northern Iraq, and the Jazeera, deployed in depth along the column's inland flank. This was not another day of harassment. This was a decision. Saladin intended to break the Crusader army on this plain, or at the very least shatter its rear guard so badly that the march could not continue. The first arrows came with the sun still climbing. Ayyubid horse archers, professionals, men who had trained with a composite bow since childhood, swept in from the east, fired their volleys, and wheeled away before the crossbowmen could answer. Then they came again, and again, and again. Think about the volume of fire for a moment. A single horse archer could fire 12 aimed shots per minute. Multiply that by several thousand riders, circling and firing at a packed column of men and horses for hours. The arrows did not come in waves. They came in a continuous, suffocating rain. The Crusaders were not fighting a battle. They were standing inside a storm. On the other side of that storm, a scholar was watching. Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, a jurist from Mosul, a man of Islamic law and letters who had been summoned to Saladin's court, observed the Crusader column from somewhere near Saladin's command position. What struck him was not the violence, it was the discipline. He wrote with something close to disbelief that the Franks absorbed punishment that should have broken any army. Their infantry marched with arrows sticking out of their padded armor and did not break stride. Their crossbowmen rotated with mechanical precision. The Ayyubid cavalry could not penetrate that moving wall of steel and leather and faith. Now come down from Baha al-Din's distant vantage point. Come all the way down to the ground. You are a Hospitaller knight at the rear of the column. Your shield is so thick with arrows, it looks like a porcupine's hide. You can feel the impacts through your arm, not as individual strikes anymore, but as a constant dull hammering. Your horse has been hit twice. It is still moving, but it flinches with every volley. The man behind you is slumped in the saddle, bleeding from a wound in the neck, and the order from the front of the column has not changed. Hold. Now cross to the other side of that formation. You are a horse archer, Kurdish perhaps, or Turkish. You have been training with a composite bow since you were old enough to hold one. You can hit a melon at 60 paces from horseback and have done it 1,000 times. Now you are riding close enough to see the faces of the men you are trying to kill. Close enough to see the Hospitaller knights at the rear, their white surcoats streaked with dust and blood, their horses trembling under the weight of armor and exhaustion. You fire, you wheel, you come again. This is the work. By early afternoon, the Ayyubid attacks had escalated from harassment to something approaching a full assault. Saladin was committing heavier cavalry, not just archers circling at distance, but lancers and armored horsemen, riding close enough to slash and stab before pulling away. The rear guard was buckling, wounded men choked the column's tail, horses were going down, and Garnier de Nablus had been sending messengers to Richard since morning. The message was always the same: let us charge, let us clear our front, we are dying for nothing. Richard refused. Every time. He could see the Hospitallers suffering, he could hear it, but he also understood something that desperation makes almost impossible to see. Saladin's horse archers were bait. If the Hospitallers charged, they would scatter the light cavalry in front of them, and then find themselves isolated, outnumbered, strung out on open ground with no infantry support, exactly as the army at Hattin had been. Saladin had designed his entire strategy around provoking exactly that mistake. Think about what Richard was asking of Garnier. Garnier de Nablus was not primarily a warrior. He was a man who ran hospitals, who tended to lepers, who oversaw charitable houses across the Levant. And right now he was watching the men under his command die, one by one, in the September heat. And the only thing standing between him and the enemy was a single word from a king who would not say the one thing that could end the agony. The restraint required of both men, the king who refused and the Grand Master who obeyed, is almost impossible to imagine from the safety of 8 centuries' distance. One more messenger rode forward, one more plea. Let us charge. We are being killed for nothing. Richard's refusal came back, but this time, something in the rear guard snapped. The Marshal of the Hospitallers, his name is not preserved with certainty in any chronicle, turned to the men around him. According to the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, the Latin chronicle written by someone in the Crusader camp, he cried out words that ended Richard's plan and started the most devastating cavalry charge of the Crusades. "We are being killed for nothing. We cannot stand this any longer." And then, without the king's permission, the Hospitallers charged. 2 knights moved first. The chronicles are specific about this. 2 Hospitaller knights, names lost to history, spurred their horses out of the formation and drove straight into the nearest Ayyubid cavalry. 2 men, no names, no glory, just 2 soldiers who had absorbed enough and could absorb no more. Within seconds, the rest of the Hospitaller rear guard followed. Grand Master Garnier, whether he ordered it or was swept up in it, rode with them. For a few breathless seconds it worked. The light cavalry scattered, the arrows stopped. But the Hospitallers were alone. The center and vanguard had not moved. They were a fist punching into air, devastating on contact but with nothing behind it. For a few seconds, the most disciplined army on the Levantine coast was coming apart. The ghost of Hattin was rising from the dust. Richard saw the Hospitallers break free. He saw them driving into the Ayyubid line. And he understood, in the space of a single heartbeat, that he had 2 choices. He could try to recall them, sound the retreat, pull them back into formation, restore the discipline he had maintained for 2 weeks. Or he could commit everything. To recall the Hospitallers would leave them exposed, pursued, potentially surrounded. To commit would mean abandoning his entire battle plan and staking the army on a general charge he had not intended to launch at this moment on this ground. He chose to commit. The Itinerarium tells us what happened next, with a sentence that reads like a thunderclap. When he saw that the enemy was pressing too closely and that our men were being grievously wounded, the king at last gave the signal. The trumpets sounded, not the thin call of a rally horn, the full-throated blast of a general attack. The signal every knight in that column had been waiting 2 weeks to hear. Then, as one man, our knights spurred forward. Close your eyes and hear it. The thunder of thousands of hooves on dry ground. War horses, destriers, bred for exactly this. Armored animals weighing over 1,000 pounds, hammering across 250 meters of flat coastal earth at a dead gallop. The rattle of mail, the crack of lances being couched, the roar of men who have spent 2 weeks swallowing their rage, finally releasing it in a single bone-shaking war cry. The charge did not come from the rear alone. It came from everywhere. The Templars in the vanguard wheeled inward and struck the Ayyubid line from the north. The French contingents in the center drove east. The Hospitallers, already engaged, now had the entire army behind them. It was not one charge. It was a coordinated eruption across the full length of the Crusader column, and it hit Saladin's army like a wall of iron. The Ayyubid horse archers, fast, skilled, lethal at range, were not designed to absorb a shock charge of armored heavy cavalry at close quarters. They were built to harass, to provoke, to wear down. When several thousand knights in full mail hit them at a gallop across open ground, the result was not a battle, it was a shattering. The first Ayyubid line broke on impact. Riders went down, horses collided. The careful spacing that allowed horse archers to wheel and fire dissolved into a crush of bodies and steel. Behind the light cavalry, Saladin's heavier troops, lancers, armored horsemen, tried to hold. But the momentum of 2 weeks of compressed rage, released in a single explosive rush, drove through them as well. And here is where Richard proved he was not just brave, but brilliant. Every instinct in every knight's body screamed the same thing: pursue. "Run them down. Finish it." Richard did not let them. He sounded the rally. Again and again. The knights, blood-drunk, elated, finally free after 2 weeks of restraint, were pulled back, regrouped, formed up behind the infantry screen. And then Richard launched a second charge, then a third. Short, controlled bursts of violence. Each one driving deeper into the Ayyubid formation. Each one followed by a disciplined withdrawal and reformation. This was the ghost of Hattin, working in Richard's favor. At Hattin, the Crusaders had charged, scattered, and been destroyed in detail. At Arsuf, Richard broke the engagement into controlled pulses. Charge, rally, charge again, exploiting the Ayyubid collapse without ever losing cohesion. The knights charged to the edge of the oak forest, stopped, turned, and reformed on open ground. They did not pursue into the trees where ambush was possible and formation was impossible. The discipline was not heroic. It was mechanical, and it was devastating. Saladin's army broke in sections. The cavalry fled first. Behind them the infantry, the levies from Syria and Egypt, men with lighter armor and no fast horses, were left on the open plain. By mid-afternoon it was over. Not all at once. Fighting continued in pockets, but the organized resistance had collapsed. Saladin's army was in full retreat, streaming east into the hills and the forest, leaving behind their dead and their wounded and their confidence. The Latin chronicles claim Saladin lost 7,000 men killed that day, including 32 emirs, 32 lords, 32 men with lands and families and retainers and political weight. Their deaths did not just thin Saladin's officer corps, they sent shockwaves through the Ayyubid domains. 32 names pulled from the fabric of an empire. In a modern army, losing 32 senior commanders in a single afternoon would be catastrophic. The political cost of Arsuf may have exceeded the military cost, and the military cost was devastating. 4 miles south, the Crusaders were in Arsuf by nightfall. The plain behind them was scattered with the debris of a shattered army. Dead horses, broken lances, arrows so thick in the ground they looked like strange crops. Now ask the question that has never been fully answered. Was the Hospitaller charged disobedience? The itinerarium says yes. The marshal acted without the king's command. But Richard never punished the Hospitallers afterward. Not a word of censure, not a demotion. Not a single recorded rebuke for breaking ranks in the middle of a battle. Some historians read this silence as proof that the charge was not as unauthorized as the Latin writers claimed, that Richard had given a conditional order, or that the Hospitallers acted within a prearranged signal the chronicles dramatized as insubordination to heighten the king's heroism. We will never know for certain. What we know is what Richard did with the moment those 2 unnamed knights created. He did not hesitate. He did not recalibrate. He committed. 4 miles east, on the other side of the dust and the blood and the broken Ayyubid line, a man who had conquered kingdoms was sitting alone in his tent. Baha al-Din, the scholar from Mosul who had watched the Crusader column march with arrows in their armor, now watched the man who had built everything he believed in sit in silence as his shattered army straggled back in the dark. He wrote the words that have defined the Muslim memory of Arsuf for 8 centuries. All of our men were wounded, if not in their bodies, in their hearts. He was not speaking of the dead, he was speaking of the living, the riders who had fled the field, the archers who had spent the morning circling with such precision and ended the afternoon running for their lives. The wound was not physical. It was the wound of an army that had believed itself capable of anything and had learned otherwise in the space of an afternoon. Saladin, Baha al-Din tells us, did not speak to anyone until evening. He sat alone, absorbed in his thoughts. This is not the image of the chivalric warrior king. This is a 53-year-old man sitting in the dark, trying to understand how the army that had taken Jerusalem had been broken on a strip of coastal sand by a 33-year-old poet from Aquitaine. That silence, is the loudest sound in the entire Battle of Arsuf. Not the trumpets, not the hooves, not the war cries, Saladin's silence. Within days of Arsuf, Richard's army reached Jaffa and occupied it. The Crusaders now controlled the entire coastline from Acre to Jaffa, a continuous strip of ports and supply lines that made any future march on Jerusalem at least theoretically possible. For the first time since Hattin, a Crusader army had a credible path to the Holy City. Saladin drew the only rational conclusion from September 7th. He would never again meet Richard in a pitched battle on open ground. He fell back on defense in depth, fortifications, scorched earth, guerrilla harassment. He destroyed the defenses of Jerusalem's approaches rather than let Richard use them as staging points. He poisoned wells, he pulled his forces back to defensible ground, and he waited. Richard marched south. He marched and marched. Twice he came within sight of Jerusalem's walls. Twice he turned back. The first time his council of war, the military orders, the local barons who understood this land, told him what he did not want to hear. Even if they took Jerusalem, they could not hold it. There were not enough Crusaders to garrison the city against the inevitable counterattack. The second time, Richard made the decision himself. He rode to a hill from which Jerusalem was visible on the horizon. He turned his horse. He did not look. According to one account, he held his shield up to block the view and said that he was not worthy to see what he could not deliver. Whether that story is true or embellished, it captures something real about the man. He knew. He had won the finest cavalry battle of the Crusades. He had broken Saladin's army in the field. He had secured the entire Levantine coast, and he could not take the one city that had made any of it mean something. The war continued for another year. It ended in a negotiated treaty in September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa. Christian pilgrims would be allowed access to Jerusalem. The city would remain in Muslim hands. Richard would sail home without ever entering it. Now here is what happened to both men in the months that followed. Saladin never recovered from Arsuf. Not physically, not politically, not emotionally. He spent the autumn and winter of 1191 watching the army he had built over decades slowly reassemble itself from the wreckage of September 7th. He continued to fight. He continued to defend. He continued to deny Richard the city both of them knew was the only prize that mattered. He died in March 1193, 18 months after Arsuf. When his treasurer went to settle the Sultan's affairs, he found the coffers nearly empty. Saladin had given away more than he kept, to soldiers, to the poor, to mosques, to refugees. The man who had conquered Jerusalem, who had united the Muslim world against the Crusaders, who had defined an era, left the world with almost nothing in his pockets. Richard fared no better. On his way home from the Holy Land, he was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man he had publicly insulted during the siege of Acre, and held for ransom. The ransom was enormous, 150,000 marks of silver, roughly 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. England was bled dry to pay it. By the time Richard was released, the political momentum he had built in the Crusade had dissipated. He spent the remaining years of his life fighting to reclaim lands in France that his enemies had taken while he was imprisoned. He died in 1199 from a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in the Limousin. He was 41 years old. He never returned to the Holy Land. 2 men who defined an era. One who wept when he took Jerusalem and died nearly bankrupt trying to keep it. One who wept at the walls he could not enter and died from a bolt fired by a man defending a castle with no strategic value whatsoever. Neither one got what they came for. So what does Arsuf actually mean? It is the finest cavalry battle of the Third Crusade, possibly the finest cavalry engagement of the entire medieval period. The execution was nearly perfect. Richard read the terrain, read the enemy, read the psychology of his own exhausted men, and built a trap that Saladin walked straight into. The restraint before the charge was as remarkable as the charge itself. 2 weeks of holding formation under constant fire. 2 weeks of watching men die and giving them no outlet for the rage building inside every one of them. 2 weeks of a single repeated order that no modern general could enforce with modern soldiers, and that Richard enforced through nothing but the authority of his presence and the memory of what had happened at Hattin. And then, when 2 unnamed knights broke the line, he turned their disobedience into a weapon. That is not just courage. That is a level of tactical intelligence that very few commanders in any era have demonstrated. But the battle's greatness is inseparable from its ultimate futility. Jerusalem was never taken. The crusade that produced Arsuf produced no permanent change in who held the holy city. The Ayyubid dynasty Saladin had built would hold it for another 4 decades after his death. Richard's achievement, extraordinary as it was, bought time and access and coastline. It did not buy what it was meant to buy. Go back to that plain. September 7th, 1191. The air tasting like iron. A king watching his men die and refusing to let them fight back. 2 nights no one remembers breaking the line. An order given that may or may not have been disobedience. A charge that lasted perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps less. 2 weeks of restraint compressed into a single moment of release. And on the other side of it, a man sitting alone in a tent who could not speak. The charge lasted minutes. The restraint lasted weeks. And in the end, neither was enough. Because some wars are not decided on the battlefield. Some wars are decided by questions that cavalry charges cannot answer. Who will hold this city tomorrow? Who will feed these soldiers next month? Who will still be here in 10 years? Richard answered the question of September 7th, 1191, as perfectly as any commander who ever lived. He just could not answer the questions that came after, and neither could the man who sat in silence on the other side of the dust.